Good morning. I'm Catherine Birch, and today I'm joined by Neil McLaughlin-Cook, the University Registrar, to talk you through the role and responsibilities of the Director of Studies. Good morning, Neil.
Good morning, Catherine.
This particular podcast has been set up to talk you through the responsibilities of a DOS, which are extensive in terms of our PGR framework here at Liverpool Hope. A number of you will be Directors of Studies, and we know from early discussions with staff in that role that there is a need for specific clarification on the fairly extensive responsibilities that a DOS has within our PGR framework. So we'll be talking you through some general principles, looking at the role of the Director of Studies in relation to supervision and supervisory teams, looking at the way in which our Directors of Studies support student development and wellbeing, and crucially, of course, their involvement in the monitoring of students' progress and the examination process. So Neil, our Directors of Studies have a very, very important role within our MPhil and PhD programmes, and I'm going to ask you over the next few slides to talk us through both the general principles of that, but then some very specific issues that Directors of Studies must be alert to.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, I'll go through these slides in a minute, but just to make clear at the outset that although the Directors of Studies do a lot, we do not require the Director of Studies to be the most expert person in relation to the topic of the thesis. The role of the Director of Studies is much more to do with making sure that the supervisory process is undertaken according to the university's expectations and that the needs of the student are looked after properly.
Indeed, we have a number of supervisory teams where we have two approved supervisors who are subject experts, but who might not necessarily meet the criteria to be appointed as Director of Studies. So there is an additional Director of Studies appointed to oversee the supervision of that student.
That's exactly right, yes. So in terms of general roles of the Director of Studies, first of all, that they take overall responsibility for the supervisory process, making sure that it follows the university's expectations. Secondly, the Director will need to make sure that the students are familiar with the university's code of practice and the underlying regulations. This is not a matter of understanding, of knowing them line by line, but it is a matter of understanding where the code of practice and the regulations can be found and making sure that students are also aware of that. We expect the Director of Studies to give guidance to students about the overall planning of a research programme. There's an expectation that the Director of Studies will make sure that from the outset the student has a draft programme of how their research will progress with indicative deadlines for completion of different stages. Now, we understand that will not necessarily be adhered to precisely, but nevertheless we think it's important for students to have a clear framework from the outset.
And I think in one of our earlier podcasts we were talking about the time it would typically take for a student to complete their thesis. So a full-time student, typically 3 years, but the absolute deadline would be 4 years. So obviously the Director of Studies role here is to make sure that that time frame is realistic and is, as far as is practicable, adhered to.
Yeah, so in relation to that, it is clear that the Director of Studies needs to make sure that the student knows that the normal expectation for a full-time PhD student is to submit within 3 years and that the deadlines are designed precisely to lead to that outcome. If the student is an international student, the Director of Studies is expected to be aware of that and to make sure that any needs of international students are taken into account, particularly in the early stage of research. And if the Director of Studies thinks that the student may need advice on language, culture, or other sorts of training, that this is provided as appropriate. And finally, but importantly, the Director of Studies is required to make sure the student understands that it is important to re-register at the start of every session in order to remain a student of this university. In terms of supervision itself, there are 3 roles of the Director of Studies. The first one is really to make sure that the supervisory team has clearly defined roles. And as we've indicated in an earlier podcast, there will be at least 2 members of the supervisory team. And it's important for the Director of Studies to make sure that each member of the team knows exactly what their role is and also that the student knows exactly what the role of each of their supervisors is. Secondly, we do expect that the student will meet their supervisory team for at least 8 formal meetings each year, and it is the responsibility of the Director of Studies to make sure that those 8 meetings take place.
And just to clarify, that's 8 meetings, irrespective of whether the student is full-time or part-time?
Absolutely, it's 8 meetings in all cases. And finally, there is a role for the Director of Studies in determining the extent to which a student will also need supervision after the thesis has been examined and in the resubmission period. And the expectation is that the Director of Studies will liaise with the internal examiner of the thesis to discuss the nature of what it is that students need to do and the extent to which they will need supervision, how much supervision they should get, and which supervisors would need to be involved. The next two slides talk more generally about the role of the Director of Studies in looking after the development of the student. So first of all, in addition to working on their thesis, that we do expect all students to develop their research skills and to complete the university's research skills scheme, and the Director of Studies needs to keep an eye on this to make sure that students are developing towards their research completion of this scheme, and they'll begin with a skills audit.
I suppose if you are a Director of Studies who is also a supervisor, that is potentially easier to do because you are intimately involved with the supervisory process at the 8 formal meetings, and obviously the more informal contacts that you will have as well. I'm just thinking here potentially of perhaps one of the challenges for a Director of Studies who is not a subject expert but still has responsibility for making sure that process is being completed in line with the expectations.
Yeah, it is more challenging, but I think the key is communication between the Director of Studies and the other supervisors. Related to that, students are expected to complete a personal development record related to their developing research skills, and the Director of Studies needs to make sure that is completed. Students are entitled to holidays, and it's the role of the Director of Studies to agree those holidays every year. And there is a role in approving the participation of students in teaching. Now, to be clear, the university approves in principle the involvement of research students in teaching of undergraduate students. However, the university is also determined that this will not compromise the progression of research students towards the submission of their thesis. And the role of the Director of Studies is to make sure that any requests for the students to engage in teaching are commensurate with the students' ability to continue to keep studying towards the PhD. If the student is based in one of our partner institutions, then this role will be undertaken in liaison with the moderator approved by Liverpool.
And it's a case-by-case basis within the guidelines for research students who contribute towards learning and teaching.
Absolutely. There are no hard and fast rules. It's a matter of academic judgment about whether the amount of work which is being expected in terms of teaching is commensurate with the student being able to make sufficient progress on the PhD. And there are two further roles broadly to do with development and well-being. The first is to make sure that the student is encouraged to develop as academics. So it says on the slide, arranges for students to talk about their work to staff or graduate seminars, to have practice in oral examinations, and to encourage students to communicate their findings to others in the academic community. And this is really all about making sure that students are not just working by themselves on their thesis, but are developing the sorts of skills and experiences that will stand them in good stead as academics later on. And finally, and very importantly, is really to keep an eye on the students, and if the Director of Studies becomes aware of any circumstances, any mitigating circumstances, such as illness or other problems in the student's personal life, any problems which might require a student's formal registration to be interrupted or amended, then the Director of Studies is expected to bring this to the attention of the university so that the appropriate procedures can be followed. And so what this might mean, it might be an interruption of studies where the Director of Studies comes to the conclusion that the student needs to take a few months away, or it might be that in the view of the student's circumstances, the Director of Studies decides that the student is not, in fact, in a position to carry on full-time, but might be able to cope with part-time study. In all cases, there are forms to be completed, procedures to be followed. But the important point is the Director of Studies keeps an eye out on the student and, if necessary, initiates the appropriate procedures.
And I think the underlying principle there is that the Director of Studies is responsible for making sure that any such circumstances or any case that is made is done in accordance with due process.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, the penultimate slide here talks about the role of the Director of Studies in relation to monitoring of the students' progress. And there are 3 points. The first one is that there's a general role on the part of the Director of Studies to make sure that students are made aware if their progress becomes inadequate or if the standard of their work is below the standards that we would expect. So in other words, if the Director of Studies becomes aware that the supervisors do have concerns about the student, that these are clearly communicated to the students, both in terms of the amount of work that the student is completing and also in terms of the quality of that work and whether it is meeting the university's expectations for the intended award.
I mean, it's worth saying as well that there is a separate podcast that's dealing solely with the monitoring of students.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, this focuses purely on the role of the Director of Studies in that. So as well as that, there is a specific role of the Director of Studies in terms of formally monitoring and taking action about inappropriate progress. So it indicates here that where a student fails to attend a scheduled meeting without explanation or otherwise is deemed by the supervisory team not to be making satisfactory academic progress, that the Director of Studies must formally write to the student warning that their progress is not satisfactory and setting targets for the student to achieve. Now, the thinking behind this is that it is important, if there appear to be problems with the student's academic progress, that this is nipped in the bud as soon as possible rather than leaving it until the formal progression points. As it stands, as it's written on the slide, it's a formal letter, but nevertheless it is at a reasonably low level, and with any luck that would work and would bring the student back on track. However, the Code of Practice also indicates what would happen if the letter sent by the Director of Studies does not achieve the desired effect, and in fact that could lead very quickly to a termination of the student studies. Over and above that, the university does have a number of procedures for formally monitoring the students' progress, which are dealt with in another podcast. And the main responsibility of the Director of Studies is to ensure that these procedures, which are called annual progress monitoring, confirmation of registration events primarily, that these are completed in accordance with the formal university procedures.
So if I'm a Director of Studies, I need to know in detail what those procedures are and make sure that my students are managed in accordance with those.
Absolutely, yes. And finally, the examination of the thesis. And there are 5 points here. First of all, it is the role of the Director of Studies to formally approve the fact that the student is now ready to submit. So the Director of Studies must sign the intention to submit form, and the university expects that the Director of Studies will only do this if the student has successfully completed the relevant phase of the university's research skills scheme. Now, the reason for this is the university is required to make sure that students develop appropriate research skills, and in order to make sure that this happens, we only allow students to submit their thesis if those phases of the research skills scheme which are required before the submission of the thesis have actually been completed. The second point there, it says make sure that the students and the supervisory team are aware that Hope degrees have no writing up stage. This is not about the duration of the programme, it is to do with fees. Unlike some universities, Liverpool Hope took the deliberate view that there will be no stage at the end of the process in which students pay a reduced fee. Instead, the full fee is payable each year until the students submit.
I think we had quite a robust discussion about this at our research degree subcommittee, if I recall correctly, because certainly for those of us who have supervised students, the phase where in the run-up to submission of a thesis is actually where there's a lot of supervisory input, and it was felt that there shouldn't be any differentiation.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And the assumption or the experience of the supervisors is that, in fact, it's precisely in the stage which other universities might call the writing up stage that the supervisors will be heavily involved. The third point here is to do with the appointment of examiners for the thesis. There is a role of the Director of Studies in helping to select the examiners, not appointing the examiners. The examiners are formally appointed by the university, but there is a role in helping to select examiners whose names would be submitted for approval. Once the examiner has been appointed, the Director of Studies needs to make sure that the student knows who their examiners will be. And also, the Director of Studies is required to make sure that the student, once they know who they're being examined by, is then prepared and supported for that examination, for example, by undergoing a mock viva. Penultimately, there is a requirement to ensure that students understand precisely what is required for the submission of the thesis. For example, it's up to 100,000 words for a PhD. There are further details in the Code of Practice, but the Director of Studies is required to make sure students follow those precisely. But finally, what the Director of Studies does not do is to attend the examination. The university is really very clear about this. None of the supervisors nor the Director of Studies attends the formal examination, and this is because our view very much is that we admit students, we train them, and at the point at which they submit their thesis, we expect that they will be able to defend their thesis without the support of their supervisor or the Director of the Studies in front of internal and external peers, and that is very much part of the process, and is part of the assumption, which means that once the student has succeeded and has the name doctor, they are entitled to join the academic community and do not actually need their supervisor to be helping them. Now, having said that, in order to make sure that the students' interests are not forgotten about, the examination will have in it not just the student and the examiners, but also an independent chair appointed by the university to make sure that the examination is conducted in an appropriate manner, and that's described in more detail in another podcast.
Thank you, Neil. I mean, clearly the role of Director of Studies is absolutely critical to ensuring that students receive, the best quality that they can in terms of supervision. Is there any, I noticed here we've got some more information for staff, but clearly for those supervisors who are Directors of Studies, there's information on the website, the Code of Practice, the regulations, so they're all accessible for staff on the website.
Yes, the Code of Practice and the regulations are clearly accessible. We offer training sessions every year as well, and as you'll see from this slide, there are further podcasts which explain in more detail how student progress is monitored and the examination and appeals process.
And if we have any Directors of Studies who have specific queries, we would always encourage them to contact either yourself or Chris Lowry.
Absolutely, we're always welcome to deal with any queries.
Thank you.